Welcome to the Radical Lifestyle Podcast, brought to you by Generation to Generation, where you will be inspired by the past, equipped for the present, and prepared for the future as we engage in conversations with people from around the world. Hello everyone, this is Andrew and Daphne from Generation to Generation, and our guest today is Simon Barrett. Simon, for people that don't know who you are, can you just say a bit about where you're from and what you do?
Sure. So you introduced me very well, and it's great to see you both, and it's great to be on this podcast. I'm a Christian broadcast journalist. I work for Revelation TV. I'm known for a program called the Middle East Report that focuses on Israel and the Middle East and gives a kind of biblical perspective as well as a geostrategic perspective on some of the key events that are taking place in the Middle East. So I've interviewed Israeli ministers of state, historians, ambassadors. Even yourselves have been on the Middle East Report as well. So you know what it's like. Also, I do a program on Revelation TV called Behind the Headlines, where myself and my co-host Reagan King, who's an American, we look to go beyond the headlines of the day and trying to understand really what is happening and what is God saying in these dramatic events that we're witnessing in this time. And then a short 25-minute program called Politics Today that gives a political perspective on some of the political events that are affecting the UK from a Christian perspective. But with Revelation TV, we have a global audience, so people are watching it from all over the world with social media as well. That's just increases the awareness of the important times in which we're living in.
You know, I have many people saying, where can we hear truth? Because we know that it is really difficult to find the truth. And I just want to encourage anybody who's listening. Andrew, you're going to put the links below, aren't you? The links to Simon's broadcasts. And I really, really, really encourage you to go and listen to them and keep up to date so you really know what's happening.
Yeah, Simon, for people that listen to this and they want to go and find out what you're doing, see some of these interviews that you're doing, where can they do that?
Well, the easiest place is just to go on to www.revelationtv.com, put the Middle East Report Behind the Headlines in, and there's like months supply of TV programs to watch. And then, of course, we're on YouTube. Just type in the Middle East Report or Revelation TV into YouTube, and then you come up with our videos. So there's lots of different ways that you can find the Middle East Report and other programs like that. So, which is good.
Yeah. Okay, yeah, and I'll put those in the description. So I recommend everyone go and check those out.
Really recommend.
Yeah.
So, Simon, with you are having glimpses behind the scenes and in front of the scenes and from all over the world, can you start us on a journey of what do you see prophetically unfolding in these days?
Daphne, that's a huge question to actually answer, but to ask it humbly, I think what we're seeing with COVID-19, with the new BidenHarris administration in the United States, and of course the global reset that's been discussed by the World Economic Forum, I think, and also we're moving so quickly towards a cashless society now, and this is what COVID-19 has created, is that it's driving this technological advancement. So essentially what we're seeing in 2021 is effectively the infrastructure being built for the Antichrist, for the one world economy, for the one world government and the one world religion. And we can see this literally unfold before our very eyes.
Yeah, it's it can pass us by if we haven't got our eyes open. And I think having people like yourself speaking into this is definitely giving us an eye opener. So can you help us unpack some of this, and also unpack it in a way that gives people hope in the midst of it all, because so many are being freaked out, and I have people in tears, and the spirit of fear which we're told will come upon us. Can you take us a bit further into some of these areas, or and bring hope as well in the midst of it all?
Well, firstly, God is sovereign, and he's sovereign. He's in control of world events. There's nothing happening that he doesn't know about. So this is something that we can rejoice in. We can have that hope in. We can have that hope that he's coming back soon. as we know that we are nearing what the book of Revelation describes as the tribulation period, that 7-year reign of the Antichrist and the one world government, the one world religion, and the one world economy. I mean, we have to understand that this will be the darkest period of world history.
Yeah.
And will make the Nazi period look like a walk in the park in comparison. So we know that great evil is coming upon the world like the world has never seen before. The good news is that's only 7 years. And myself, I actually believe in the pre-tribulation rapture, where it says that believers will not endure the wrath to come. And I think that gives us incredible hope. And that's why I think the need to get the gospel out, the saving power of Jesus Christ, is absolutely essential. But Daphne, to break down what you're saying of why we're leading into this so quickly, we have to look at world events. And to understand the times that we're living in, we also have to understand international relations and global politics. As America is still the only world superpower, it's the United States that sets the agenda for the rest of the world. Now, certainly since really since the late 1980s, I would say, particularly starting with George W. Bush, Bill Clinton, and then George W. Bush, the son of George Bush, with Barack Obama. They all had a kind of globalist agenda to push for world government and to increase the power of global institutions such as the International Monetary Fund, the World Economic Forum. You have the likes of course, the United Nations, the Security Council, and heading into very much a kind of globalist system. Now, we know that Britain voted against being part of the European Union, and that was Britain's attempt to be used by God to come out of this global system that can ultimately describe as a system of Babylon, or the Tower of Babel. So this is the situation we face. And what was extraordinary in 2016, two political movements emerged. First, we saw that with Brexit, where the shock of the entire nation and probably the world, that the British people actually voted to leave the European Union, granting us our own sovereignty and our own independence, going against the globalist trend. And then in November of 2016, we saw the emergence of Donald Trump, who pulled America completely out of the globalist system. And that, I think, is a badly choice of term. He used America first as a reference that he will put America's interests first before the interests of other nations. And that upset the globalists to such an extent that they've done everything over the past 4 years to actually get rid of him. So over that period from 2017 to now, there was a pause in this push towards globalism. And what we've seen in 2020 with the global pandemic, COVID-19, this has really accelerated this calls for globalism, calls for world government. And this is why we see that Joe Biden is now the 46th president of the United States, and he will push the world into closer integration. And personally, I think this is the end of the grace period that the Lord has given the Western nations, particularly Britain and the United States, to turn back to God and put our trust in Him rather than in humanity.
If we go back a bit to, I want to get your perspective on the media, and so going back a bit into Trump's 4 years, you can see this massive shift in the media, a very anti-Trump perspective. Even Fox News really kind of sitting on the fence. It's kind of straddling, leaning one way or the other. And I don't think there's much doubt that the media had a massive impact on the elections, which we've just had in the US. There's a massive distrust of the media. I think a lot of the news has now shifted from them broadcasting what's happening to becoming opinion pieces. And so what's your perspective on the media right now? Because I think as we continue on, we'll circle back around to the things that we've been talking about in terms of the one world system and things like that. But yeah, so what's your perspective on the media right now?
Well, I work in the media profession. It's my livelihood. It's what I'm called to do. Journalism, and essentially you have to understand what journalism is. The role of journalists is not only to report and tell the truth, but it's also to provide scrutiny against government policy as one of the checks and balances in our democracy. But what we've seen over the last, probably really since the emergence of the internet and going into the early part of the 21st century, is that news has become 24/7. So we are constantly bombarded with news stories, news events. We're having news at our fingertips. You only have to open our phone and we get instant news of what's actually happening. And what is called the kind of global news circle. And these are the big stories that all the big TV and the newspapers and the radio and other print journalists follow these big stories. So it becomes what you call a news cycle. So to give you an explanation of what a news cycle is, for example, as of this recording, we've just seen that Joe Biden has been inaugurated as America's 46th president. That was global news. So that's what I mean. This is a big event that occurred, that has changed the face of America, changed the face of the world. Therefore, this is a global news story. Now, what we've seen over the last couple of decades in particular is where the likes of the big media conglomerates would have their correspondents all around the world, say in Israel, or they would be based in Iran or other places. That's no longer the case because of budget cuts. Same with newspapers now. It's very rare that even with the broadsheets that you'd have a correspondence in some of these countries. So where we see a kind of major conflict kick off, and I'll give you an example of this one, was in Israel in 2014 when Hamas started to fire rockets and missiles into Israel. And we saw that the nation of Israel, 3/4 of the nation of Israel was paralyzed. Israelis were running to their bunkers. They couldn't go to school. They couldn't go to work. And people were trapped in the homes. And then when the sirens went off, they only literally had less than a minute to get into these bunkers to protect themselves. And for the first time in that conflict, Tel Aviv came under threat of Hamas's rockets and missiles. So we see that Israel had to respond in a military operation to sending ground troops into Gaza to actually remove that threat. And this is where we see the media come in. They don't give a kind of rational explanation into the events, what led up to those events, why those events are occurring, what is the strategic dynamics that's happening at this time. Instead, they just pick one narrative, and that whatever Israel does is wrong. Israel is just bombing the Palestinians in Gaza just for the sake of it, and excluding the fact that the nation of Israel came under huge attack and missile attack from Hamas, and that Hamas were using something known as asymmetrical warfare, where they fired their rockets and missiles around highly dense population areas, firing rockets and missiles with using women and children as human shields. And then any journalists who came into Gaza covering that conflict were threatened with their life if they didn't toe the Islamist terrorist line by Hamas. So therefore, they all said this is Israel bombing schools, bombing hospitals, attacking ambulance, and making Israel look to be the aggressor, when the reality is that it's Hamas, who's a genocidal terrorist organization controlling the Gaza Strip, were firing rockets and missiles. So what does that do in practice? Well, what that does in practice is it has a huge impact on government policy, and that's the role that the media play today. That policy is shaped by the media. So when people saw those images of buildings being destroyed in Gaza with women and children outside them crying, they said, look at these awful Israelis, look what Israel's done. So therefore, we need to place economic sanctions upon Israel for the destruction they've caused, without understanding that conflict in its context. And that's the danger. We're also seeing with our mainstream media now that it's more about opinion than fact. And sadly, I think what 2020 and 2021 are representing is that we're no longer living in the age of truth. We're living in a post-truth world, and what is my truth is your truth, and that's your truth. So there's no moral absolutes anymore. And this is what makes it very difficult in terms of news reporting. We're also seeing there's a huge agenda, and the media has been used to effectively tell lies. I was doing a news review of the year for 2020 for the Middle East Report, looking back at some of the big news stories affecting Israel and the Middle East. And when I looked and did some research on a CNN paper looking at all the key events, they failed to mention the Abraham Accords, the fact that President Trump had managed to have a ceremony on the White House lawn between Israel, Bahrain, and the United Arab Emirates. Refused to mention that. Refused to mention the fact that President Trump brokered peace between Serbia and Kosovo, and should have actually been nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. So we see that journalists and news corporations are no longer looking at truth. They have an agenda, and that's very much of a liberal agenda. And anyone who stands on kind of conservative biblical principles, we're considered now as non-purgata. So there is a very great danger that in all of this, what we are actually missing out on is truth, and actually reporting the facts on the ground as they are. Instead, what we're seeing is opinions and liberal left-wing agendas. And that's not media, and that's certainly not journalism.
Yeah. And again, I want to say this is why people need to head to your sites to really find out what is going on. And when you said people are not taking into account the whole situation on the ground, they're not even taking into account the situation in the world. I mean, you have to look at North Korea, and that's just getting off free. There is no, Israel is being treated as if it was operating like North Korea, and we know that from the number of the attention that it's been given in the UN.
Absolutely. And this comes into this bias because it fits into this kind of narrative that Israel is a colonial occupying power, that they've stolen lands belonging to the Arabs, and they oppress the Palestinian people, and so therefore Israel should be judged on that matter, and that when Israel faces Islamic terrorism, whether it's from Hamas or Palestinian Islamic Jihad or from the Palestinian Authority itself, then this is not seen as part of this kind of global fight against terrorism and a fight against ISIS and Al-Qaeda. This is a separate territorial dispute, which nothing could be further from the truth. As we know that Israel is the only kind of democracy in the region. It's the only beacon of light. And if it wasn't for the Israelis, then there would be no schools in the Palestinian Authority. There would be no roads. There would be no hospitals. There would be no electricity. There would be no communication. So the fact that Israel has actually done so much and even put her own security at risk in order to make a compromising peace to allow for the creation of a Palestinian state, despite the fact that this would pose a national threat to Israel's security, tells you something about the Israelis. And sadly, this narrative never gets reported.
Yeah, I think now that we have, as you mentioned before, we now have President Joe Biden. Before we talk about this new administration and what possible implications there could be for the US and the rest of the world, because as we talk about Israel, there'll be big implications for them as well. Looking back on President Trump's 4 years, how would you summarize that? What's your takeaways from his term, good or bad? How would you summarize his 4 years in power?
To ask that question effectively, the problem is, and this is particularly the role of the mainstream media, that they've judged President Trump on his character and his personality. They haven't analysed his policies. And when we look back at what he's done is absolutely incredible. He's nearly bankrupt the most dangerous regime in the world, that is the Islamic Republic of Iran. And I fundamentally believe that if he had won a second term in November 2020, then we would have seen the collapse of Iran and their totalitarian system, which would then mean that the threat of terrorism around the world would be massively and dramatically reduced around the world. He was on the verge of doing that. We also know that he has stood up for the persecuted church. He has actually empowered the US State Department to protect and to look after the plight of the persecuted church around the world. Even President Trump threatened presidents, or for example, like Nigeria, to actually protect Christians who are being persecuted in Nigeria. It's an example there. We've also seen that what he's done for Israel is incredible. He was the first US president to recognize Israeli sovereignty over Jerusalem. And to mark Israel's 70th anniversary as a nation reborn, he moved the US embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, despite the whole world saying that if you do that, we're going to see nothing but riots and violence, and this could even result in war. He did it anyway. We also saw that he recognized Israeli sovereignty over the Golan Heights. And in November 2020, we saw that his Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, actually was the first US Secretary of State to visit Judea and Samaria, as well as the Golan Heights, in support of Israel and the Jewish people. We also saw that President Trump allowed born-again Christians in administration, namely his Vice President, Mike Pence, and Mike Pompeo. And then we had also Nikki Haley, who was America's ambassador to the UN. They stood on righteousness. And we also saw there were many prayer gatherings, Bible studies in the White House. President Trump recognized that above him was God and that God was sovereign, rather than the extreme secular humanists represented by the Democrat Party. We also saw that he allowed the gathering of 30,000 American Christians to pray for the United States, to have a call of repentance and to protect the unborn. If he'd won a second term, then it's very, very likely with the conservatives dominating the Supreme Court, that abortion could have been made legal in the United States, reversing the kind of federal laws surrounding abortion in the states, protecting potentially millions of babies being born. So effectively what we saw was a presidency that was chaotic, but it was based on biblical values, defending Israel, defending the unborn, defending the persecuted church, and giving essentially born-again Bible-believing Christians a hope that there was someone in the White House who understood the importance of God and the importance and power of prayer. And effectively, that's what we saw during President Trump's term in office.
I mean, I am taking a slight curve, and I don't want to stay there, but I think we need to not stop praying for President Trump. For Donald Trump.
He's still president.
He's still president.
Yeah, they keep the president title even after.
Oh, they do. Oh, that's okay then. Being educated along with the rest of the world.
Yeah, don't take that away from him.
No.
They've tried to take
but to take away
else.
the title, I think would just be too much for him.
Yeah.
No, I just got lost in the way. Anyway, we need to still keep praying for him. I just cannot imagine the enormity that this man has stood against. We interviewed David Slyker from the House of Prayer in Kansas City, and about his book, The Rage of the Nations. And I very much believe that Donald Trump stood against that rage. And he is a man like you, Andrew. And his family stood against it. And I just imagine what it must be like for him in this time to know what he stood against, and to know that he has been pushed out of the way, and the things that he stood against can move forward under the lordship of Jesus, of course, and under his design. But I just feel very burdened that we should continue to pray for him as his family.
No, absolutely. And I don't think there's anyone in recent history that has been ridiculed, that has been hated, that has been mocked such as President Trump. And really what he was coming against is the spirit of the age, that antichrist spirit. And we know that that is going to be the most powerful, dominant ideology as we are rapidly moving so quickly into what the Bible describes as the last days.
So now we have this new administration, President Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. Your initial thoughts, fresh off of their inauguration?
Well, I watched. I was recording 2 programs yesterday, so I didn't watch all of the inauguration, but I certainly saw Joe Biden being inaugurated. Now, my first impression was that, despite the fact that the Democrats represent this extreme, secular, humanistic, liberal ideology that actually is the driving force behind the Democrats, they still couldn't get away from the fact that God was still mentioned, God was honored. They sang a kind of amazing grace. So God's presence was even there, even though they refused to acknowledge him. Now, Joe Biden is a Catholic. He's only the second Catholic ever to win the presidency. Of course, the first was JFK, who was assassinated in '63. And Joe Biden's the second. But in terms of the kind of Catholic values, he's flip-flop from one to the other. 1 minute supporting the views of the church, then going against it, voting for abortion, voting against abortion. So we see that he's a man who's double-minded. He's an old statesman. I think he's kind of naive in a sense that he doesn't know really what's happening, I don't think, behind him in terms of the agenda belonging to the Democrats. And also that I'm not so much concerned about Joe Biden, because he's picked a very elderly team and administration behind him, but it's who would be in the running after him. And this would be Kamala Harris, representing the most extreme liberal senator in the US Senate. And if she became president, and I think it's only a question of time, because I can't see that Joe Biden would actually last 4 years in office, that she would take over and she would push through some of the most extreme liberal policies that we've ever known or ever seen, and certainly is far more extreme than President Obama was. So that is a major concern going forward. Also, the other major concern, I think, with the Biden administration is the fact that they hold unprecedented power, because they hold both chambers. They hold the Senate and the Congress and the presidency. So for 2 years, they can push through what I can only describe as an extreme liberal agenda. And one of the first things they want to do, I've read in his first 10 days in office, is to make 11 million illegal immigrants citizens of the United States. Thus they can vote, thus keeping the Republican Party forever out of power, or they would be forced to have to move to the left in order to actually win votes, which would then leave American born-again Christians out in the cold. So there is a dark agenda. There's agenda to re-engage with the world, re-engage with globalism. We've seen that Joe Biden, for his election campaign, used the slogan "Build Back Better." We've seen that with the Canadian Prime Minister, as well as our own Boris Johnson. And this all comes out of the World Economic Forum and their push for the global reset. So we have to wait and see. But we know that the world is rejoicing. But I don't know if Christians are rejoicing at the news that Joe Biden is now America's 46th president.
Yeah, and for people, we're told to pray for those in leadership, and so Absolutely. we should pray for Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. For people that there are serious questions about Joe Biden's health, his mental state, and so we don't. I don't say that in a mocking way, like the legitimate concerns. We should pray for that. For Kamala Harris, why should people be so concerned about her views? What is it? What is her stance on things that sends her so far to the left?
She's a big supporter of the extreme liberal agenda. So we know this is those that advocate that position want to see the end of Christianity, particularly in America and the West. They don't want prayers said at school. They don't want prayers said in government. They don't want God acknowledged. They don't want the Bible read. And effectively saying that, the persecution would really start against born-again Christians from her perspective. Some of the advisors that she has around her are extremely anti-Israel. And someone like her having the presidency and having the opportunity to form her administration with her own cabinet would be a very scary prospect. And the Democrats knew this. And this is why I think they played an absolute masterstroke in the presidential election of 2020. We saw that Joe Biden was actually losing in the polls to become the Democrats' presidential candidate. And he was behind Bernie Sanders. He was like third or fourth in the list. So they wanted a candidate that was the complete contrast of President Trump. They wanted someone who would show empathy, that someone would look like he was an elder statesman, someone that was gentle, and someone that they felt that the American public could relate to. Now, they also know that his time in office, he wouldn't be in office for very long because of his age and his ability to do the job. I mean, he's in his late 70s. The demands of office of state are absolutely incredible. The stress, the pressure, the decisions you have to make. It's hard enough for someone in their 40s or 50s to do this job, let alone someone in their late 70s. And knowing that he could probably only be in office for a short term, they knew that if they had Kamala Harris, then she would push through their extreme liberal agenda. But they knew that there was no way that Kamala Harris would ever be elected and that the American people wouldn't actually vote for her. So they knew that this was their best way of ensuring that Kamala Harris would be president. And I think it's only a question of time before she does. But for those who stand for biblical values, this is a wake-up call to us all that we are really seeing the start of persecution against born-again believers in the Western world.
So what can we learn from this in this moment in time? Because people had a vote. Now, we won't go around the whole, was there fraud and all the rest of it. Let's just draw back from this at the minute. People had a vote. People have a voice. People can speak up, people can stand up, people can pray, people can fast, etc. So how would you encourage people? How would you say to people, this is what we need to learn from this going forward, and this is who we need to be, this is what we need to do going forward, using this time as kind of the springboard for us as Christians?
Daphne, that's a very good question. I think at this time, I believe the Lord is saying to us, look, let's not put our hopes in presidents or prime ministers or governments or institutions. I'm going to bring a judgment, as I think the last 4 years of the President Trump's administration was an opportunity for America to return to God. We saw that at a government level and amongst the governmental institutions. But we didn't see this happen in American society on the grassroots. There wasn't a spiritual awakening. There wasn't a revival. There wasn't a returning back to God. And in those cases, then we see judgment. And when the Lord sees the state of the modern church in the Western world, described in Revelation 3, the church of Laodicea, it's neither hot nor cold. And because of that, Jesus said, I will literally puke you out. I will puke you out of my mouth. So therefore, that is the kind of spiritual state of the church in the West. It's become too comfortable. It's become materialistic. It's become rich and saying that we don't need God. But what persecution does is it brings a refining fire to the church and to believers. It's not pleasant. We've enjoyed in the West, particularly in Britain and the United States, well over 200-300 years of religious freedom. And that's something that we've all taken for granted. We've realized that religious freedom is one of the core tenets of our democracy. and living in a democratic liberal democracy. That's what this gives us. But we see that times are changing very fast and very, very quickly as we see the events of the end times unfold. So effectively, I think the Lord is using this in order to purify his church and bring it back so it's then ready for him, and the church can do incredible exploits like it did in the early church. Because as long as the church is self-reliant on itself, as long as it thinks it's rich in its own sight, as long as it feels it's self-sufficient and money's coming in, and you have big church pews with loads of people, then there isn't this great desire then for this great spiritual hunger to see an awakening of the Lord. So maybe in times like this, particularly as we look back at the administration of President Obama, we started to see real persecution against American Christians and the discrimination against American Christians in the States, which then led to so many Christians praying and interceding. And then we got 4 years of President Trump. So I don't know if we actually have time for another godly administration the next 4 years. Who knows? But the one thing I believe God is wanting to do is to purify his church at this time and make them ready as for the bride.
And bring in the harvest.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So you mentioned the global reset, and people have probably heard this reset word being thrown around, but maybe don't quite understand what it is that this is that we're talking about, that's all in the media. Can you just give maybe a summary of what it is, and then talk to us about where you see things going as we move forward?
Well, if you answer that question, maybe even this time last year, it wouldn't have resonated. And this would have been considered conspiratorial, in the shadows. But what we've seen in 2020 is the fact that these agendas for globalism have come out in the open. And we've seen that the World Economic Forum, which is where world leaders, top businessmen, economists, leaders of the big tech giants, and those who have influence, effectively huge influence in the world, meet once a year in Davos to discuss strategies and policies to challenge some of the big issues that we faced in the world today. Now, what's happened really in 2020 is that the World Economic Forum has overtaken the power and the influence of the United Nations as being the kind of globalist institutions. Now, we've seen that they have called, and even has the support of Prince Charles, is that they've called for the Great Reset, a reform of our capitalist system. So effectively what they're saying is that they want to overthrow capitalism, and they want to replace it with a more fairer economic system. And they've also said that they want to provide equality around the world. So effectively, the big nations such as Britain and European nations and first world nations would see a redistribution of that nation's wealth going to the poorer countries, and that we would all be happy owning nothing. So effectively, this means more power to the hands of the elite, the complete destruction of what is the middle class, and everyone effectively on the same wages in the same household, and that all of us would be happy earning nothing. And then this fits in with their moves to use technology, creating a kind of cashless society, focusing on climate change as a big issue in order to gain more sovereignty of nations, in order to gain more power and economic control. So we've noticed that this has come to the forefront in 2020. My big question really is, can this be implemented at this time? And that's the big question.
Well, it certainly set the scene for it. I mean, we've got the World Health Authority, haven't we, as well, sort of ruling the nations about what should or shouldn't be done in that. Whatever you think about the outcome, that they are absolutely key, that nations are looking to. So I want to just swing again. there is a world out here while we are preparing as a church, while we're focused on ourselves as a church about how we want to be ready for the return of the King, how this is what the saints of old have looked through, and really, although it may look horrific to some, it's what they look for, it's what they were longing for, and we get to be the generation to experience it. I mean, we get the privilege of living in these days, although it may not seem to some like a privilege. I sometimes lie in bed and just dream and imagine, gosh, we could see his feet on the Mount of Olives. We could see him coming back. We could see him going through the Western Gate. And, all those places that we've been to in Israel, suddenly that they're lifted into even higher profile for us, even who've been backwards and forwards there. So we are living through these days with high expectation in the midst of it. However, there's a great commission that is not completed. There are people in our streets, there are people in our cities, there are people who are being dragged along by this, and increasingly so. There is a church that is divided. There are those, there's the great falling away in the midst of it all. And I think it should not just make us self-centered in that, wow, we get to live it, we get to see him, we get to prepare, but it should also turn us out with increasing urgency.
I often talk when I give public speaking engagements. I often then having to communicate to my generation and younger to try and make them understand that we're living in biblical times, and the way to do that really is to change the narrative. And as a big fan of the Back to the Future films, and just really use that as a concept, that if we had a time machine and we could go back to biblical times and go back to see the likes of David defeat Goliath, or to see Jesus feeding the 5,000, or we see that Jesus rising Lazarus from the dead, or seeing Moses and the Israelites cross over the Red Sea with the Egyptian army in pursuit. If we had the ability to have a time machine and go back and see these incredible biblical events, but the times that we're living in, we don't need to. That's what's so exciting about these times, is that we are living now in biblical times, and we are that generation that have been called for this generation and this time. And that comes with a lot of responsibility, but I fundamentally believe that they're, particularly because of the global pandemic, COVID-19, has opened people's hearts to not only the gospel, but also to understanding where we are on God's prophetic time clock. The essential message to explain the times that we're living in is a massive asset in terms of preaching the gospel, because we can explain, look at the book of Revelation and saying that these events are soon to come upon the earth, and you have a choice to make. So there is a great responsibility. We are living in incredibly exciting times where literally we're seeing Bible prophecies that have been written over 4,000 years ago being fulfilled in our time. But that also comes with a responsibility. But that also gives us hope, because we know that our redemption draws near. We know the end of the story. We know that Jesus wins. We know that Jesus is coming back and he's going to rule and reign for 1,000 years. So what do we have to fear?
Yeah.
And from what you said when you're talking to the next generation, we are called generation to generation. So we have a huge mandate that one generation should be passing on to the next. And this is an increasingly urgent time that we do tell the next generation. I'm alarmed that they're taking it as far as children have no clue what's going on. No clue at all. They're not being prepared. I mean, we've said many times the book of Revelation has been taken out of the hands of a generation. I mean, it has. They know nothing. And yet that lack of knowledge isn't going to stop them experiencing it. They're going to be in it. And there is an urgency to tell them, an urgency to prepare them. And we have said for years, as we've travelled around the world, get the next generation ready. They're going to wake up one morning and everything be different. And here we are. it has woken up. I mean,
Yeah.
I'm praying, God, give us another window in the middle of these birth pains where we can go back to where we've been and increasingly sound the alarm, because I feel it's even more urgent than the years that we've had before.
Yeah, and when you look in the media, the news, you can see the agendas the world is pushing. You can see them reaching the next generation. I mean, they are pouring into them their agendas, their messages, and the results we can all see. They are shifting cultures, and yet for years we've traveled the world telling the church, you have to get back to the biblical ways of doing things. We have to reach the next generation if we're going to stand a chance. And like you said, we often reflect on those places we've been to and say, did they heed the warning? Did they hear us when we said we have to reach the next generation? So it's encouraging, obviously, as well, hearing you saying, you know, when I get the chance, I'm telling people, you've got to reach that next generation. We have to reach them if we're going to shift a culture.
No, absolutely. And I think that there's something when God touches the heart of a young person, what he's able to do with them is absolutely incredible. For those who are maybe watching and they're teenagers, if they completely surrender their lives to the Lord and just give it over to him, God can do the most extraordinary things with their lives from a young age. It gets a lot harder as you get older. I'm not saying that God can't use people powerfully as they get older, but there's something very powerful when the likes of a Joshua generation rise up and say, no, we are not going to be coward. We're not going to be feared. We're going to stand for the truth. We're going to proclaim Jesus Christ as the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords, and that he is the only way to the Father. And that has a huge, powerful impact upon those around them. Now, don't get me wrong. It's very, very tough for born again believers who are part of that millennial generation. It's extremely tough. I mean, they are having to go against a whole tidal wave of immorality, a whole tidal wave of demonic thoughts. And often they'll probably find themselves very much alone and very isolated with their beliefs. But if they hold true to God, then God can do extraordinary things in their lives. And that's what's exciting, that they can really take the attacks to the enemy and start raiding the enemy's camps. Because that's what you do when you're younger. I mean, I'm 46 now, so I'm no longer in that kind of young age category, but I remember being in my 20s and in my teenage years having a real passion for the Lord and wanting to push through things and seeing what he can do is extraordinary. But it comes down to a place of surrender, that you have to surrender your life entirety to him. Then he can work on your life, and then he can just really use you in the most powerful ways for his kingdom. Like, I never thought myself, I left school, I finished school at 16 with only one GCSE in PE because I was dyslexic. I was 2 years behind. And then God fast tracks you, end up doing my A-levels, end up getting a degree. And then I'm working with some of the kind of top journalists in the country and having that training from there. Now, these are people that have been to Oxford, they've been to Cambridge. They are the kind of the elites of the elites. And then the Lord puts you in amongst them. And that's what he can do, because he gives you this kind of supernatural power, supernatural understanding, and that we can shine in this generation.
Well, I just want to pick up a couple of things that you said. One, how hard it is for this emerging generation. Secondly, you mentioned the Joshua generation, and I want to speak to all those of my generation or your generation above and say two things out of that, and say it clearly, because we've said it over and over again. First of all, yes, they're the Joshua generation, but why shouldn't the Moses and Joshua generation enter together this time? Why shouldn't we rise up and go together to enter the land? We don't have to model ourselves on a situation where Joshua went alone because Moses dishonored God before the people. We can rise up. Yes, they're finding it hard. Yes, it's difficult for them. Why would we abandon them to that? Why would we not be right there with them? Why should we not be supporting them? Why should we not be in relationship with them? Why should we not be praying for them? And the biblical model of discipleship is generational. It's not peer.
Absolutely.
Everybody disciples someone who was younger. So I hear what you said as a huge warning. And just in case anybody in my generation switched off, this is a wake-up call and is sound alarm to our generation. We cannot sit back. We cannot abandon them. We've got to go with them. And it's time for us to wake up, sit up, pray for them, and even more, relate to them and walk with them through these times. So thank you for pressing my generation to generation button and giving me 2 minutes to preach the message.
No, it's so important. And I think Andrew probably can concur with me as well, that to be in the position that I'm in today, I've literally had to fight my way through. I've had to fight it. I've had to fight people that have had kind of ministries and thinking that I'm at the top, therefore this is all about me, and not preparing the next generation of leadership to come through. And I think this is the biggest problem within the Israel ministries, is that people have held so tightly to their positions of power and influence that they haven't trained and prepared the next generation for the struggle ahead. And this is why if you go to a pro-Israel meeting, you see so many grey-haired and white-haired people, because the next generation hasn't been prepared for what is the most extraordinary prophetic events of our time, and that's the re-establishment of the modern state of Israel in fulfillment of biblical prophecy that marks the fact that we're living in the last of the last days. So this is an example of where I think there needs to be a fundamental change and attitude to equip the next generation, and those that of myself and Andrew's generation have had to fight to get here. It hasn't been easy. There hasn't been that kind of discipleship. There hasn't been the kind of support and the encouragement. We've literally just had to fight in order to get to these positions where we can be used of God to communicate truth to the world, essentially.
Well, I would say to my generation, that's to our shame.
For those not hearing anything, there's a few tears being shed.
You carry on, because I can't.
I think this is a good place to wrap. I mean, it's the challenge to all of us for younger people to not, if you've been in one of these positions where you've had to fight to get there and you haven't had the help of the older generation, to not criticize but to still honor them for the things that they have done.
Absolutely.
And so we're told to do that, to honor previous generations. Some of us have been fortunate to have people that have tried to help open doors, and previous generations have sowed that we may be able to reap things that we have. And so we thank those in the older generations that have done that for us. And it's a challenge to older generations who are listening that the younger people need you. We need you to pour into us, to challenge us. Even my generation, for the next generation coming after us, we all have responsibilities to the generations previous and following. And so, what can we do as a takeaway from this to be more intentional with how we're doing that, in honoring and pouring into? Simon, thank you so much for taking the time to spend some time talking to us and sharing with us some of your thoughts about what's going on right now in current events, but also for bringing this generational challenge. We always appreciate that when people do that. So thank you so much.
And thank you, Simon, for all you are doing to speak truth to this world, and for the passion that you hold for it. And we honour you, and we're so thankful for you and Revelation TV and all that you are doing. Thank you.
That's very kind of you. So thank you very much, you both, and thank you for everyone watching this very important program.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode. If it inspired you, please rate us and subscribe on Apple or Google Podcasts, Spotify, or another podcast platform.